Hello everyone and welcome to Chapter 12, Communicable Disease. So before we dive into communicable diseases, I wanted to stress the importance of these diseases as they do cause about 31% of deaths globally, especially in low and middle income countries. These types of diseases do disproportionately affect the poor, have huge economic impact and consequences, and unfortunately, much of the burden of these communicable diseases is avoidable and can be prevented or treated with proper tools and education. So communicable disease transmission, there are a few different ways that these diseases can be transmitted: animal to animal, animal to human, and human to human. I'm sure you've heard the term infectious disease. For the sake of this class, we are going to use communicable disease instead of infectious disease. They are essentially the same thing. Communicable diseases do include infectious and parasitic diseases such as Lyme disease, West Nile virus, and malaria. So some of the key terms within communicable disease chapter: a case is an individual with a particular disease. You'll often see research studies in which they refer to case A or case B. That's simply speaking about the individual with any particular disease. Case fatality rate is the proportion of persons with a particular condition who die from that particular condition. Control or disease control is reducing the incidence and prevalence of a disease to an acceptable level. You'll hear this used quite frequently with regard to global health and global initiatives to control communicable diseases. Elimination of disease is reducing the incidence of a disease in a specific area to zero. Emerging infectious disease is a newly discovered disease. Eradication is termination of all cases of a disease and its transmission globally. You'll hear that polio has almost been eradicated, and in all honesty, I will have to look back at the book, but I believe polio has reached eradication status. Parasite is an organism that lives in or on another organism and takes its nourishment from that organism. Case, the one that comes to mind to me is fleas. So fleas will live on animals and feed off of that animal, the blood supply from that animal. A re-emerging infectious disease is an existing disease that has increased in incidence, spread to a new place, or has taken on a new form. One might say that influenza might fit this bill. So again, going back to the transmission paths for communicable diseases, we have foodborne. So these are the diseases such as Salmonella, E. coli. And then cholera and rotavirus are waterborne diseases. Then there are sexual and bloodborne diseases such as hepatitis, HIV. And then our vector-borne illnesses: malaria, West Nile, Lyme disease. Then inhalation is tuberculosis, influenza, and meningitis. And just to kind of touch on this a little bit, we're all very familiar with influenza because we have influenza outbreaks in the United States every year. Hopefully everyone, if you are a believer in vaccinations, that you've already received your flu shot for the year. Inhalation means that it can be passed by droplets. So someone sneezes or coughs, it is then transmitted onto a surface, and then another person touches that surface. Or, of course, if someone coughed on you or sneezed on you, that you can inhalate that disease. Then there are non-traumatic contacts such as anthrax, and traumatic contacts such as rabies. So when we talk about communicable disease, we want to talk about the different concepts. First one that comes to mind, I think probably for everyone, is vaccination. Whether you are for or against, it has been proven that vaccination does play a huge key and a huge role in controlling infectious disease. Mass chemotherapies, vector control, such as mosquito abatement. Fun fact, or probably not necessarily fun, there are areas within the state of Idaho, such as Gem County, in which there is no mosquito abatement. They're now suffering disproportionately large cases of West Nile virus. And it's one of those things that you can't go back and retroactively vote in to have mosquito abatement within your county. Apparently it takes an act of Congress. I'm being sarcastic, but they've been trying to get that back on the docket for many, many years now, only after these increased cases of West Nile have been showing up that they figured, wow, we probably ought to do something about our mosquitoes. So, that being aside, other concepts: improved water, sanitation, and hygiene, as we discussed in previous chapters, how lack of sanitation and lack of clean and safe water supplies can hugely affect the health of a population. Then case management and treatment and improved care for certain contagious diseases. Case surveillance, reporting, containment, and quarantine. And then, of course, those behavior changes, those in which we can make the decision to undertake a prevention or not. So neglected tropical diseases, I threw this in there just because the fact that it's neglected, to me, makes it something that really needs to be discussed. So there are still 13 parasitic and bacterial infections that fall under the neglected tropical disease umbrella. Worldwide, they affect more than 1 billion people and about 500 million children. So though they are neglected, they are certainly not, I don't want to say forgotten, but they're definitely prominent out there. They're prevalent, huge incidents of this. So they have a terrible impact on health, impede child growth and development, harm pregnant women, and often cause long-term debilitating diseases. So some of the challenges that we face in the future with regard to communicable and infectious disease is we need to have enhanced political commitment globally to the prevention and control of these diseases. We need to have commitment with communities to overcome underlying causes, such as inadequate water supplies, lack of sanitation. And because our health systems in many of the low and middle income countries will continue to be weak, we need to have efforts to be based on partnerships, building on the success of public and private partnerships. So we need to really have buy-in from all parties. And then we need to strengthen the surveillance of disease at the national, local, and global level. When we have an outbreak of these infectious diseases, they need to be handled sooner rather than later, and they need to be handled appropriately, which brings up the lack of adequately trained and appropriately deployed human resources for health, as well as the challenge of financing such enhanced efforts. And then, of course, our scientific and technical and technological challenges. We're very fortunate in the country and in the part of the world that we live in that we're on the forefront of these scientific and technical improvements to health. Unfortunately, those low and middle income countries don't really have not only the resources, but the technologies to overcome some of these prevalent, hugely debilitating diseases such as HIV/AIDS. I tried to go through this really quickly. I realized there were a lot of slides. And communicable disease, and in our next chapter, non-communicable disease, is a huge, huge part of global health, and probably the one that most of us think of when we think about global health overall. Thinking about the low and middle income countries and the prevalence of malaria, diarrheal diseases, HIV/AIDS, and how the higher income countries have made such strides in the fight against these diseases, and those lower and middle income countries are still fighting such an uphill battle. So anyway, food for thought. Hope everyone has a good week, and I will see you in chapter 13.